you see, how you read that morass of detail and come out with such important ideas and add to them. When you're working, I'm sure anyone who is, we're all working on papers and research projects, and after a while, you don't know what you're writing. You don't know what makes sense. You're so familiar with the same phrases, the same words. It doesn't mean anything anymore after a while. So, I just wish everybody could have the same experience as this, to get this kind of feedback. You know, it's been really 30 years since I really began this, and there's many interruptions. And I only wish that I could have availed even more. But I think that the four of you sitting here, like I just melt. You can see why these four people, and I'm sure there are, everybody else would be up here too, for different reasons, and have this effect on on people doing research. I would not have been able to complete this work without them. And Imrana is the first person in this group of four who inspired me back in the 70s. You probably weren't aware of the effect, Imrana. And then Mohan, her partner in crime, at the Center for Social Medicine and Community Health. And then in the year 1997, being invited to talk about the initial work, the results that I'd been trying to pull together at JNU, and I don't know who it was, one of you or both of you said, you need to talk with Niladri.
Yes.
And by that time, actually, I had met Prabhu, thank God, that in Toronto, the year we were there. And in each case, each of these wonderful people took the time to, who on earth is this woman? And what is she doing? And and it made all the difference. I had a list of thank yous. I don't even know where they are now, but certainly these are among them. I cannot thank you all enough. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened without you. And I guess we can say that about everyone here. Isn't that? I know it sounds trite.
No.
But it's not. So so let me thank you all. Let me thank you for coming to this, Rama. Thank you also in 1997 for, and I'm sure I'm missing many people. Let me just add two more names to this list. This is a very jumbled list. The late Professor Biswa Moipati is responsible for taking this garbled, enormous manuscript and saying yes to Routledge. He was co-editor of the South Asian History of Health and Medicine series. And, you know, my debt is just bottomless pit. Debt to him, and to Routledge. I respect Routledge for choosing him as a co-editor. And he died within weeks of emailing me to say yes, we'll take this. This is an interesting study. So my debt to him is profound, and I only wish I could have said this to him in person. I didn't. And I only wish I could have talked with him about his own work on Delete and Adivasi's. Odisha people. The other person that I'd like to thank specifically, certainly Mohan for pulling together this lodge. I mean, he pestered, as you probably know he does, but he pesters for in my opinion, of one example, for good reason. I mean, I'm really, really very grateful. Not easy. Not easy in the best of times, but in the worst of times right now, it's just remarkable that you have pulled this together. And it's remarkable that all of you have taken time. I'm sure all of you are involved with your work, but also with the political situation. So I really, really thank you all for coming to this event. I would also like to thank specifically Professor Romila Thapar for being present and that adding that support, general support. I have to say that your unwavering demonstration of the importance of history to contemporary life and political process has been important to me and is known more widely than JNU and India. So thank you. We all contribute, I guess, to the work of everyone, but this is an important example as well. So we don't have very much time left.
15 minutes.
15 minutes. I will maybe just give a quick run through of some of the results for those who certainly won't have the time to wade through this morass of detail. Now, if I can figure out how to work this machine, I presume this is it's been sitting here. This is England and Wales mortality graph of Thomas McEwen that Mohan referred to. And it's a demonstration of historical shifts in lethality of a particular disease, in this case tuberculosis, a leading cause of mortality historically in Britain. And you can see where modern science, modern medical science came in right at the end. And probably that graph would have continued down even without it had social conditions, economic conditions continued to improve in Britain. I put this on and I'm going to look at another one if I can. Is this the right button? Or to press? Let me, no, that's not going to do it. Oh, great. So I'll use this instead? Yes, okay. This is just another example. This is also in England and Wales. This is measles mortality. And measles vaccine only comes in at the very end. Now, this doesn't mean that measles vaccine is useless or unimportant, because there are several children per 10,000, 5,000 that die unnecessarily. So immunization is important, preventive care is important, treatment is important, but they clearly, in the case of England and Wales, contributed only a tiny, tiny fraction. Now, the power of the germ paradigm and germ transmission since McEwen produced his work in the 60s and 70s, this is so patently obvious, and yet his work has been dismissed by advocates of public health, or it's quite astonishing that it has been dismissed. One can argue details and timing and data, but the overall trend. And that's how powerful the paradigm is that keeps us from looking at food, 2 square meals a day, as the basis of human health. Anyway, I'll just, now, it's difficult to track our history of health. And by history of health, I mean at the very elemental level of life expectancy, of going from the pre-modern norm of 20 to 25 years of life expectancy, which is what was documented in all of India, colonial India up until 1920. Going from 20 to 25 years to going up to 70 years, and now up to 80 and more in some societies. This is, we could get a hint of this historical trajectory through census data. And in the case of India, these census indicate that at the turn of the century, life expectancy was probably 20 at most. 22. The increase in the second decade is influenza, so it's quite anomalous, somewhat anomalous. Certainly, even influenza mortality was far higher in South Asia, and particularly in the famine tracts, which was 1918 and 1917 as well. That was a war. That was on World War I scarcity, prices, hyperinflation, just like in World War II with Bengal. Although we don't talk about 1917 very much, because there aren't records. The British didn't, it was so bad that the records weren't kept, and there was no famine relief. With war, again in Bengal in '43, no famine relief. But this doesn't tell us very much why this is happening, this decline after 1920. What does help us investigate and sort through the underlying causes for this decadal census-to-census decline are the vital registration data. And those data are sitting in the India Office Library for every province from the 1860s, and they contain huge reports, charts of month-by-month deaths per district per year for a broad number of categories, and especially the categories the British imperialists were interested in, particularly cholera, smallpox, and then this large category of fevers, which was a catch-all. So that always fevers were far greater than any cholera mortality. And Christopher's, he was an extraordinary mind. He was a polymath. He was asked. He was young, and he was asked after the 1908 fulminant epidemic of malaria that finally got publicity back in Britain. He was asked, "Do something about this. Help us. We've got to stop these fulminant malaria epidemics. They're going to undermine. They are undermining our imperial rule." And so it was a political need for the British to stop the malaria epidemics. And of course, Ronald Ross who actually identified the malaria parasite in the vector in 1897-8, and had won the Nobel Prize for Medicine, the second one granted in 1902, was vocal in pushing the India Office and the government of India to eradicate mosquitoes everywhere. in India, and that this was possible if they just worked at it. Well, every monsoon rain brought mosquitoes by the trillions everywhere. It was just so preposterous, the idea of eradicating mosquitoes everywhere. And of course the government of India knew this, but were pressed by the power of the germ paradigm by that time. And now added to the germ paradigm was the vector germ paradigm. And it was so embarrassing for the British that they were forced to, and sanitary officials, some, like Ross, were pushing the government within India to eradicate mosquitoes. Where's the money? That it forced the British hand, or the government of India's hand, to, instead of eradicating mosquitoes, which was impossible, to eradicate famine. And to convince the Rosses, who was never convinced, but sanitary officials within India, that this was going to work, they needed a really excellent report. And that's malaria in the Punjab. Ostensibly an analysis of 1908 epidemic, but in fact Christopher's, the only way he could prove this and very solidly, was to look back and start inventing regression analysis in Punjab. Yes. He did, with just correlations. So it's those vital registration registers that are, in my experience, I think they're unique in the world. They're probably the only series that is regular and extensive for 50 years of life expectancy at 20 years. In Britain, when McEwen was doing his work, life expectancy already in England and Wales was about 45. So it misses that first doubling in life expectancy to be able to show just how powerful 2 square meals a day staple food grains is for human history, health history. I'm getting carried away. How many minutes have I got left? 10 minutes. Okay, let's see what's on. Okay, these are the maps. This is 1908. This isn't his drawing. It's based on his mapping, tassel by tassel, across the province, mapping mortality in that epidemic period. Punjab is exceptional. What Christopher's recognized with these vital registration reports is that the diagnoses, the classification of cause of death, couldn't be depended upon, right? But you didn't need a diagnosis. All you needed was a monthly tally, month by month, because each of the major infectious diseases, infective diseases, some aren't infectious, but they, each of the diseases are distinctive in their timing, in the yearly cycle. So malaria fever death would be, all recorded under fever, would be those deaths in Punjab in a particular little space of the year. October, they would peak in October, and if it was an epidemic year, they would continue to be high for another month or two. So what I've used is the October to November, December fever, third quarter fever deaths. Christopher uses October, November, varies, but and in Punjab you can do this even more accurately because transmission of malaria is highly seasonal, extremely highly seasonal, because of the ecology, the dryness and the low humidity preventing transmission. It's only the immediate post-monsoon rains where you actually get malaria transmitted. So Punjab is, and Christopher's recognized this, is really the perfect place, perfect region of malaria to do a quantitative analysis in relation to rain and price. Now, Christopher's doesn't, he's a diplomat, right? He's a loyal servant to the crown. He doesn't blabber on about destitution like we do. He's very cautious in his language. So it's sometimes difficult to follow the reasoning. It's often a bit indirect, but it's there. It took me about 4 reads of Malaria in the Punjab to really understand what he was saying. And some of the confusion in rainfall had 2 consequences. Rainfall in Punjab brought malaria, but it also brought flooding. And flooding, if in a population that was already destitute by preceding harvest failure, drought the previous year, and high prices, flooding compounded the destitution, widespread, and prolonged it. So the combination, so the effect of rainfall in the regression analysis is actually measuring both transmission and compounded destitution. That's why it's a little bit confusing to see. Now, we can then separate. Christopher's analysis was done up to 1908, and he didn't do any further analyses. He was sent off to the First World War in Mesopotamia and all that stuff. But the data, that those annual reports are still there. So after I could see that Christopher's was actually right, at a district, I did a district level analysis, which was a little clearer. I won't go into the details. I thought, well, why don't I extend this to 1940? And that's where, let's just see if this will work. This is another famous epidemic. And what you can see by this focal character shows that mortality in both these years, and in with heavy rainfall, good rainfall years, everybody got malaria in the whole province. You know, there was rain and transmission, but it was only in certain parts that the mortality soared. And the pattern of this mortality is what Christopher calls focal. It gradually intensifies to 10, 15, 20, 30 times the normal level as you approach the center of this focal spatial pattern of mortality. That can't be explained by mosquitoes. It can't be explained even by flooding. And he alludes, again very cautiously, diplomatically, and said, this is like a map of atmospheric pressure. Well, yes, but for the year before. It reflects drought and harvest failure. Those areas that had experienced drought and then the next year flooding were the ones where the mortality was extreme, even though everybody was getting in the entire province. That's his insight. So when you look at malaria mortality, which is in this analysis and his is October to December fever death rate. From 18, can you see the numbers and whatnot from here? The initial few years is just under registration. the registration system was just getting going. But basically, you see this classic sawtooth mortality that we see in other populations, other societies historically. It's a little bit more extreme in Punjab. But after 1920, these huge spikes decline, and in fact, almost disappear by the 1940s, except for another famine, which I'll talk about later. You can see this district by district after 1920. These fluctuations decline, dampen dramatically. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's no change in rainfall. The rains still come. There's no change in flooding. If anything, flooding is worse. And there's no change, effectively, in access to quinine, the only treatment. The only thing that changes is profound, fundamental changes in famine relief. And you've picked out so many things. It's just, I can't tell you how thrilling it is to hear you all identifying things that are really important. It's just, it's so satisfying. Yeah.
You written very clearly, so we follow you. So
you'll have to hurry a bit now.
Yeah. Okay. Mohan's telling me I got to get my act together here. Now, what's interesting here is that this is Bengal. And this a similar pattern after 1920 is happening. And in fact, if any of you want to do historical work in other provinces, you probably find the same pattern.
Ceylon.
Okay. Where does this understanding go? All of malaria control, malaria policy after 1908 and 11 was premised on Christopher's study. So I can't prove this. I haven't actually gone into the unpublished archives. But my bet is that famine policy also was Christopher's inspired. It had to be. Where did the understanding go? I have a couple of quotes, if I can just... Okay. This is the most prominent. George MacDonald was the most prominent epidemiologist in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and was calculating mathematical malaria, predicting mathematical malaria. And this is a conclusion. There was, as I talk about in volume 2, a similar major malaria epidemic in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in 1934-35. Huge mortality levels. But there was also famine. There was the most severe drought leading up to the epidemic, and there was the depression, the economic depression, which had thrown so many laborers out of off the plantations. So there was extreme destitution, and yet the Ceylon epidemic marks the point where hunger disappears in medical discussion. It was there, it was in the Indian Medical Gazette up until Ceylon. And I don't think MacDonald had a strong, I'm sure he was an imperialist, strong imperialist, but I don't think he was pretending. I think he believed this. And for the life of me, I don't understand how he could have spoken to the Ceylon epidemic and Christopher's report and come to this conclusion, and yet he did, openly. And that's what continues to inform to the present day. It's still considered related to germ, parasite, plasmodium transmission, and not hunger. It's disappeared. I think there was something. Yeah, this was just another. These were expatriates that thought they knew about malaria after the Ceylon epidemic, and pronounced that it was due to breeding of the Anopheles mosquito and lack of immunity. So there were two, in the interwar period, from 1920 to 1940, there were two new medical subspecialisms that emerged and just took over the entire agenda. One was nutritional science, and within 10 years of nutritional science coming on from the early 1920s to the early 1930s, discussion of hunger and the economic determinants of ill health disappears and reappears as insufficient immunity, acquired immunity. And that these conclusions were just taken out of the air without any evidence. I think, Imrana, you talked about there being no evidence to support this. I've got 5 minutes. What do I say? I have to reply to some of these wonderful comments. Let me just refer to this. This is Paul Russell, who is in volume 2 to explain how this understanding got lost. Paul Russell was a lead expert of the Rockefeller Foundation. And the only thing I would take a little bit of issue with, Imrana, I don't see Rockefeller as being beneficial at all.
No, but that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
He was the one who stopped them
Yeah.
from putting the
Earlier,
thesis forward.
younger guys in Bandung were more connected.
Yes, yeah. I don't phrase that correctly. Right from the beginning of Rockefeller's involvement in South Asia,
Yeah.
but around the world, Rockefeller set up between 1915 and 1930. He set up more than a dozen enormous institutes of hygiene and public health.
Yeah, anemia control,
Hookworm first. It began
And hookworm,
Began with hookworm.
yeah. Germs became a creed. The Rockefeller creed was germs cause poverty. So if we get rid of the germs, poverty will go. It's not imperialism. It's germs, and it's ignorance of those foolish, stupid natives, right? And the effect of Rockefeller globally was to indoctrinate, and openly indoctrinate all medical fields, and India was not immune to this. The All Indian Institute of Hygiene and Public Health in Calcutta was a Rockefeller. Yeah. Anyway, so there are many aspects to the fate of the human factor, Christopher's human factor. There's subspecialisms that divide researchers and make them experts in a narrow field, and they don't take into account other fields, especially the socioeconomic. And this is one example, and it continues, its legacy continues today in the WHO. Russell was parachuted into India, a Rockefeller expert, in the dying days of the empire, in the late 1930s. I had 2 years of trying to eradicate mosquitoes in southern India, and suddenly he's a world global expert, which failed, and suddenly he's a global expert on malaria. And it just happens that the Second World War breaks out, and he's deputed by the Allied forces to control typhus and malaria in the theaters of war, and including Southeast Asia. And at the same time, DDT comes along. So Russell becomes this expert on DDT,
Yeah.
and with the close of the war, Rockefeller orchestrates Russell's appointment to the new evolving WHO, and orchestrates malaria as the cause of global poverty and the priority disease for WHO. We are still living with that legacy, although there are efforts to alter it. This is just, yeah, that's Bengal famine. That's what happens in the normal pattern of seasonal mortality pre-famine is the lower line, and that peak is malaria, the largest contributor to famine mortality in Bengal. I thought there were some other. Let me just go back. Okay. This relates to DDT and the impact of DDT on mortality in the 1950s. And the bottom line is crude death rate. The top is crude birth rate. What you see on the bottom death rate graph is from 1920 to 1940 is this reduced epidemic pattern until 1942. This is Punjab. And in 1941, there was the failure of the rains, often happening. But in the case of 41 and 42, it was wartime, just like in the First World War, famine, and just like in Bengal, famine was blocked from being declared as famine. So there was no, the famine code was not implemented. And malaria soars in this is East Punjab, in the eastern 11 districts. So it's another. Can I just go? The steep decline from 1942, actually 1945, is in fact a real decline. DDT comes along in the early 50s, 54, 55, but there's really, for various reasons, there's almost no decline in crude death rate with DDT. DDT overnight eliminated malaria transmission, and yet there's virtually no change in mortality. I would explain some of these bumps that can't be explained by DDT that, if there were more time. That's in the end of the first volume, if you're interested. I would say two things. I have not answered, I haven't begun to answer many of these questions that you raise. I will try.
No need to answer.
As we talk a little bit more, but I would say the question is not either or, 2 square meals a day, or access to curative care or preventive. It's important to save lives, individual lives. And it's important, even if you're well fed, if you get malaria, it's a good idea to get treatment, right? There will be there is an inherent lethality to every infection. And in malaria, it's a significant lethality, especially with falciparum malaria, malignant malaria. And that's what's in much of South Asia. I would feel very badly if anybody left thinking I was saying treatment, curative treatment, preventive is useless. It's not useless. It's really important. And in fact, this history is the strongest argument you could have for extending reliable access to basic care, health care, in any society where there is still hunger. And we know that there is still hunger, and there is precariousness. So I'm not saying, and please don't anybody say, I'm afraid that as with McEwen's work, it was misinterpreted, often gratuitously, as saying, oh, McEwen is saying that preventive care and treatment isn't important, doesn't save lives, and dismissed on that basis. And the last thing I would want is that to be the interpretation for this study, for India's health history. And for anyone talking about the uselessness of DDT, I wouldn't ever use that word. But I would say that if you do talk about the marginal impact of DDT, you probably will be criticized for exactly the same reason McEwen was.